Weedflower, Chapter 4. Can I walk by myself? Sumiko, Uncle, and Jishan sat in the truck down the street from Marcia's house, where she'd made Uncle stop. She was ashamed of herself, but she didn't want anyone to see the old truck. Jishan said, "You ashamed of family? Shame on you." "No, Jishan, Uncle chimed in. "She just wants to show she's a big girl." "Not big enough to drive to party by self," Jishan muttered. But he seemed resigned, and Sumiko got ready to jump from the truck. "Okay, I'll be right here for you in 2 hours," Uncle said. She reached across Jishan and hugged Uncle wildly. "I love you, Uncle." He beamed at her. She ran off, even though she heard Jishan complaining. "No hug for old man?" Her blue dress rustled as she stepped onto the street. She waited until the old truck had gone before walking to Marcia's house and up the porch steps. She could hear music already. Glenn Miller, one of Auntie's radio favorites, and so many voices. It was a boy-girl party, the first anyone in her class had ever thrown. She breathed deeply of the scent from her beautiful bunch of peach stock. She made herself stop smiling so she would seem gracious instead of silly when the door opened. Then she knocked firmly on the door. A maid opened up. The maid looked surprised to see Sumiko, but took her present and flowers. The first thing that caught Sumiko's eyes was a large painting of whom she assumed was Marcia's mother in a tutu. The painting was so beautiful, Sumiko felt breathless. Then something kind of rolled across the room, but she wasn't sure what it was. Then she realized it was silence. She'd once seen a short film clip of time-lapse photography, of shadow moving across a field. That was the way the silence rolled across the room, starting at the far side and ending right here with her. Across the room, Marcia's mother, Mrs. Melrose, was staring right at Sumiko. She looked just like the painting. Her lips were coral, and her dress was royal blue. Sumiko checked to make sure nobody else was nearby whom Mrs. Melrose might be looking at. No, it was just her. Mrs. Melrose smiled and moved gracefully across the room. She put out her hand. "I'm Marcia's mother," she said. The room grew loud again. Sumiko smiled with relief and shook the lovely hand that was offered. She gushed. "Your house is beautiful." She'd scarcely had a chance to see the house, but she'd noticed the couch was velvet and the ceilings were high and the doorways were arched. The boys wore neckties, the girls colorful dresses. Marcia's mother put an arm around Sumiko and moved her onto the front porch. In the sunlight, Mrs. Melrose looked older than she had inside, but her eyes were kind. She smiled so warmly that Sumiko couldn't help smiling even harder than she already was. Mrs. Melrose shut the door gently behind them. Sumiko thought Mrs. Melrose wasn't so much graceful as she was elegant. She wore a diamond clip in her hair. It was shaped like a slice of melon and must have had 30 diamonds in it. "Marcia didn't tell me you were in her class." "Oh, I've been in her class since she moved into the district." "It's just..." She had mentioned there was a Japanese girl at her school, but I didn't know she meant in her class. So when she asked whether she could invite the whole class, naturally I said yes. Sumiko didn't understand. "Yes, I think every single person said they were coming. Marcia did a poll on Friday." Marcia's mother touched her face and said in a soothing voice, "What lovely skin you have." "Thank you." Mrs. Melrose smiled again. "It's not me, dear, but my husband has a few friends in the back. Some of the other parents who helped him raise some money for a charity we work with." She looked hopeful, as if she wanted something from Sumiko. "I just want you to understand that if it were up to me..." And Sumiko realized that she was being uninvited. Marcia's mother saw that she understood and said, "Wait here." She went inside, again gently closing the door, and in a moment she reappeared with a big slice of chocolate cake on a cloth napkin. "You can keep the napkin," she said cheerfully. On top of the cake was a tiny ballerina doll for decoration. Mrs. Melrose went inside again, and Sumiko stood on the porch with the cake. She looked at the ballerina, listened to the music, looked at the door. She played the last few minutes over in her head. Uncle had left her not 5 minutes ago. She noticed a boy from her class peering at her from the window. Her face felt as hot as when she was lighting the fire under the tub. Then she felt furious. Without thinking, she knocked on the door. The maid opened up and waited, but at first Sumiko wasn't sure what she wanted to say. Then she blurted, "I need my present back." She wasn't going to let Uncle's money be wasted. That would be like they were stealing from him. The maid retrieved the present and handed it coolly to Sumiko before shutting the door. Sumiko saw several of the other kids now watching her from a window. She took her cake and present down the steps and started to walk away. As Sumiko walked, her only thought was to get away. The problem was that she couldn't walk too far because Uncle and Jishan were going to pick her up later. She walked to Lane Street, where there were some small businesses. There was a bench near one store, so she sat on that and watched the clock on top of the bank across the street. She stared at the clock and felt disbelief that she wasn't at the party listening to Glenn Miller, but instead was sitting on a bench by herself. Like anyone, Sumiko had known momentary embarrassing moments, but right now she felt so overwhelmingly humiliated that it was as if nothing in her life would ever be the same again. As if everything she did, disbudding flowers, heating water, cooking rice, would be different from now on. In the future, she wouldn't be Sumiko, who is disbudding flowers. She would be humiliated Sumiko disbudding flowers. She wouldn't be Sumiko heating water and cooking rice. She would be humiliated Sumiko heating water and cooking rice. And right at this moment, she wasn't just Sumiko sitting alone on this bench. She was humiliated Sumiko. This is what it felt like to be lonely. 1. Like everyone was looking at you. Sumiko noticed that a few passers-by were in fact looking at her sitting in her party dress with her pretty pink gift on her lap and a piece of cake by her side. 2. Like nobody was looking at you. Sometimes the passers-by didn't even glance at her. 3. Like you didn't care about anything at all. This happened for about 30 minutes. She felt a big blank inside of her. 4. Like you were just about to cry. This happened for the whole rest of the time she sat on the bench. After a while, she opened the present and took out the scarf. She left the wrapping on the bench and headed back toward the corner where Uncle was supposed to pick her up. Before she reached the corner, she balanced the cake in one hand. With the other hand, stuffed the scarf into her underpants. She didn't even care if anyone saw her. Then she waited at the corner with her cake. Uncle arrived early. She made it back just ahead of him. Jishan sat in the passenger seat, but scooted over for her. She climbed in and sat next to Jishan. He and Uncle both beamed at her. Jishan looked at the cake. "Oh," he said, "expensive. That cake expensive." Uncle said, "We'll make a dessert out of that tonight. I'll put the ballerina in a glass case for you." They both looked so excited for her and so expectant that Sumiko felt obligated to say something cheerful. She exclaimed, "That was a fun party." She couldn't bear to tell them the truth. They'd be too disappointed. Jishan might even do something crazy, like knock on the Melrose's door and scold them, or try to beat up Mr. Melrose and his two friends. Uncle said, "Did they ask you to sing?" "Yes, I sang for 3 minutes and everybody applauded." Jishan's face grew so proud and he smiled so hard, Sumiko thought his teeth were about to pop out. Uncle said, "Your aunt told me to ask you if they have a nice house." She hesitated before saying harshly, "It wasn't as nice as I was expecting." Uncle looked disappointed, so Sumiko said, "But it was very nice. The couch was velvet. The doorways were arched." He shook his head in admiration of the velvet couch and arched doorways. Did the kitchen have nice tiles? Her uncle asked. Tiles? You know how your aunt has always wanted a kitchen with pretty tiles, Uncle added. Yes, they were pretty. With a hand-painted design? Uncle asked. She pretended to think. I guess so. That's what I would have thought. After a couple minutes of driving, Jishan and Uncle both commented on how quiet she was, and Jishan worried that she might have caught something at the party. She forced herself to chatter as much as she could, but it was tiring. Dinner was even more tiring. Everybody asked her questions and then oohed and awed when she answered. At some point, for no reason, Jishan exclaimed, Maybe someday you be prom queen. A couple of times, Auntie said she looked pale and felt her forehead. Everybody ate a thin slice of the cake for dessert. The cake was proclaimed delicious. Finally, thankfully, dinner ended. After she cleared the table, Sumiko stood for a few minutes in front of the photograph that sat on the bureau behind the dining room table. In the photograph, Jishan and her mother, father, aunt, and uncle stood solemnly in front of the curtain. The ladies wore kimonos, the men suits. Some of Jishan's hair was black, and he held a small Japanese flag. Whenever she examined the picture, she could feel everybody in the house staring at her back. She imagined they were feeling sorry for her because she didn't have parents. She went into the kitchen and began filling the sink with water, but Auntie called out, You don't have to wash dishes tonight. The little ballerina lay on the counter next to the sink. Sumiko dropped it to the floor and mashed it under her slipper. Then she threw it out the window. Sumiko went to bed early and listened to the crickets sing, while the rest of the family played cards in the living room. Once, to make herself feel better, she reached under her mattress to look at the receipt book she'd found on the street a year ago. She sometimes filled out the receipts and pretended she was selling flowers at her own shop. She loved her receipt book. When Tak-Tak came in for bed later, she didn't say a word. Eventually, the house grew still. And so Sumiko could finally allow herself to think about that minute alone on the porch, with the other children staring at her from the window. And she could finally allow herself to cry. She had wanted so badly to go to that party. She had wanted so badly to look pretty in her dress. She had wanted so badly to make friends with some of those girls. She didn't even notice the door open, but suddenly Bull was by the bed, one of his big mitt-like hands wiping her wet face. She sat up and sobbed in his arms. He was so big and wide, she couldn't reach her arms around him. In the dim light, she saw Tak-Tak step around the curtains of the blankets. She cried out to him, "Leave me alone!" "What did I do?" he said. Bull turned and said quietly, "Go to bed, Takeo. I'll be right there to say good night." He spoke kind of in grunts, the way a bull would speak if bulls could speak. She sobbed so hard she couldn't get her breath. Bull handed her a handkerchief. When she blew her nose, it felt like her brain was coming out of her nostrils. "I can fix it, you know," he said. "What?" "The ballerina. My mother found it on the porch." She cried even harder, but remembered to lower her voice so Tak-Tak wouldn't hear. "Bull, they wouldn't let me come in the house. I didn't go to the party. They made me leave." She tried to cry silently, but it just made her snort when she inhaled. She lowered her voice even more. "But Bull, is it just because we're Japanese?" Bull didn't answer for so long that Sumiko thought he hadn't heard her. But then he grunted. "Yes." "Only that?" "Yes." Then he said, "Gaman." That meant, "We must bear it." After a while, Bull pushed her away, and she could see he was smiling gently. "Look at that," he said. He was gazing outside. She followed his gaze and saw Uncle standing in the moonlight near the outhouse. talking to it and occasionally gesturing with his arms. Whenever Sumiko saw someone talking to the outhouse, she always knew exactly where Jishan was. She and Bull laughed, and at last she was sleepy.